let's resume our study of Genesis chapter 1 by looking at a few key words that pop up in verses 6 through 10. So, our key words today are going to be expanse, which is quite an interesting word, waters, which we've already talked about, but we'll explore a little bit more. And then following that, we're going to talk about the land. Now, I know that we've talked about these things before, but we need to talk about them in conjunction with each other. And because of that, we're also adding the word heaven to what we're talking about. So, to recap, God is a God of order, and he sees this problem of an uncreated world as wild and waste. Wild meaning chaotic, and waste meaning empty of life. So, what's he going to do about it? Well, first, he wants to sanction off or section off certain areas from other areas and make those clear dividing lines. You know, growing up in Texas on a goat farm, I can appreciate the use of a good fence, and that's what we're seeing God do today. He makes a fence around the world, or a better analogy would be a greenhouse. So God looks at this world that doesn't have separation of waters from waters and land hasn't appeared yet, and he says, well, you know, the first thing I have to do is separate the waters from the waters. And he uses something called, in Hebrew, a rakia, and in this translation, which is NASB, an expanse. And some translations also call this a dome. And the idea is this. The ancient peoples looked up to the sky and they said, you know what's probably up there? Past the sky? A ton of water. And you know what's below the land? You guessed it. A ton of water. And God, when he made the world, he must have separated these waters apart. This is not a scientific statement as much as it is a cosmological statement. And that's a very important word, cosmology. Coming from the Greek cosmos, which means world or even universe, and logi, meaning logic or word or study of. And in their understanding of cosmology in the ancient Near East, they saw God perform this loving act of making creation a place perfect for humans to exist and thrive. Humans cannot exist and thrive in waters, whether the waters above or the waters below. So God in his love separates the waters using rakia. Rakia is a Hebrew word, the root of it meaning to hammer out. So God, almost like a sort of blacksmith or carpenter, is hammering out, exerting effort to create a place fit for human life. You could imagine a separate sort of metaphor being a greenhouse, right? A greenhouse is a place that you can have a very specific environment within. You can have it the right temperature, the right humidity for life to thrive. Outside of the greenhouse is dangerous, though, especially on a rainy, stormy day. In this way, the Hebrews saw God making the world as an act of love, essentially making a perfect place for humans to thrive, which actually fits in rather nicely with modern cosmology and understanding of how special the earth is for human life, how against the odds our existence even is. So God makes this expanse, the rakia, the dome, the hammered out thing, to separate the waters from the waters. And he makes the expanse, and the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the rakia skies, or heaven. Remember, heaven most of the time simply is referring to the skies that you and I see every day. But the idea is that above the rakia, above that thing blocking the waters, is God's space. He lives above the waters, above the rakia. This lends a little bit more logic whenever Paul says, I went up, or I knew a man who went up to the third heaven. We can imagine the first heaven as being the skies that you and I can see and interact with and that the birds fly up against. And the second skies being the dome that blocks off the waters from us. And the third skies, or the third heavens, being where God himself lives and rules and reigns in the Hebrew cosmology. Let's move on. There is evening and there is morning, a second day. Wonderful. As the days move on, God will shift his mindset away from separating things, and instead he will fill things. So let's look at the last separation and distinction that he makes. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So let's scoot down here to look at what this means. So far, we have the idea that everything at one point was just water. Not literally, more so metaphysically. It was a chaotic mess, totally absent of all creation. And then God creates light as a statement about who he is. And then he separates the waters from the waters. He makes essentially a pocket, you could say, in which people can live. But people still can't live in this empty, airy space underneath the rakia, or the dome that blocks the waters. No, he makes the dry land. And the dry land is an important word. It's eretz in the original Hebrew. And the land doesn't refer to the planet, it refers to the ground, the physical stuff that you and I step on and walk on and plant things in, which is what happens next. So we see in these few verses, we almost have a miniature sermon on the nature of God. He takes the chaos, the mess of life, of the universe. He takes time and effort to express his will and his word, not to create more chaos or to plunge humans into a dangerous place, but rather to create a safe space, a beautiful place, a place where human beings can thrive and live under the protective rakia and expanse in the midst of the waters and on the dry land. And he won't just stop there. He will also make the dry land a place where we can thrive with trees and vegetation and fruit and animals. In this way, even in these few verses, we see the love of God at work. And that is one of the ways that we can read Genesis chapter 1 the way it wants to be read.